during my adolescence, I was really badly bullied at school by boys. And I always mention that because I'm a girl's girl. But at that time, like I said, you just want kind of boys to be maybe a little bit interested. Yeah. And to be like seemingly abhorrent to these boys and just like being told I was disgusting and all these other things. I mean, it was so damaging.
Hi, and welcome to A Class of Their Own podcast, revealing the human stories behind their name. We will hear honest and intimate reflections from our guests who, despite their circumstances, shape a world that reflects their unique visions of success. Join me, Mira Magecha, to learn from these inspirational people and take the first step to make your own change. On today's episode, we're joined by Rebekah Clark. Hi, Rebekah, how are you?
I'm really good, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, good. I'm really glad you made it. And you were on time, whereas I was really late this morning. So thank you for your patience.
Of course.
We met through a group where you replied to one of my messages to say you may have a story that I may be interested in listening to. And oh my God, was I interested in listening to it. So you're going to start with your journey and all of those things. But I think there's some real fundamentals in terms of what your story will go through. But also, I think there's a lot from what I've heard, and I've only heard a small snippet of that conversation. There's some real empathy that I've got for what you've been through and how you are who you are today. So I'm going to start with, who is Rebekah?
Who is Rebekah? That's such a big question. Who I am today is a woman in her mid-40s who is a proud North London resident. And that's important because, as will probably come out in our conversation, I was born in North London, but didn't grow up in North London. I'm the mother to a gorgeous 5.5-year-old who's just joyful and wonderful. And I'm a wife, a friend, a business owner, all of the things that probably my 16-year-old self would have, really dreamt to come true, but maybe at that point might have thought not completely possible.
Yeah.
I feel like I've reached, on the one hand, like a really nice chapter and part of my life, but as life is, certainly not without its challenges in some ways. But yeah, a place, I was part of a project that's actually officially launching tomorrow. It was a photography piece by this amazing photographer called Sane Seven. Her work, she mainly focuses on powerful women. So she's often in the Times, Telegraph, those kind of things.
Right.
And the whole piece is around women over 40. And our photographs were taken without makeup and just showing up exactly as you are. And I remember, really being up for it, but I was challenging myself. It's unlike me to do anything like that without a blow dry or makeup and, looking the part. And as part of that shoot, I was asked the question, what does kind of being over 40 mean to you? And I responded that, I know exactly who I am. And there's something that I've find really powerful in that, because it means warts and all, it means not just the good stuff, but recognizing my vulnerabilities, my insecurities, where I make mistakes sometimes, and just being in a position of embracing that, along with recognizing some of the good stuff too. And so I think I always remember older women kind of saying, or even reading about, when you reach your 30s, you're going to feel this sense of relief and life's going to feel much easier. I think particularly psychologically. And my best friend Rachel and I were kind of going to our 30s saying, not sure about that. Not feeling that. I'm not sure they were telling the truth. But I think that there is something about your 40s where at least I have felt that a bit more. And I'm now hearing from women in their 50s and 60s that it kind of only gets better.
Yeah.
And I can definitely sense that that's probably true.
Amazing. And that's a really interesting place that you are now compared to where you were, because you said, for example, when you were 16, it's something that you could have only dreamt about. So take us back to your earliest memories of growing up.
Probably one of my earliest memories, and I would have been around 4, let's say. And there's kind of 2 parts to this memory. One of them was dancing with my big sisters, who my sister Dawn is 14 years older than me and my sister Amanda is 18 years older than me. So I was a little girl and they were proper kind of teenagers. And I was dancing in the bedroom to Elton John, something probably like I'm Still Standing, because that feels like a real soundtrack to that, my kind of early years. And I remember my sister saying, oh my goodness, like she's got natural rhythm. This girl can dance, which I just never forgot. And around that same time, I remember looking in the mirror and even as a small girl having this sense of knowing like I'm brown and my family are white. And it was this, I wouldn't have been able to articulate why that felt strange, but I just for the first time ever knew something was different about me. And the reason for that was when I was 10 months old, I was taken into emergency foster care. As I said before, I was born in North London and I spent the first 10 months of my life in North London. And unfortunately, my birth mother was not in a position to care for me properly. And from what I understand of that time, social services became aware of me, were very much, I have since seen my file actually. And so there was a lot of interaction with my birth mother and them trying to let me stay with her essentially, but that wasn't to be. And so things became quite dramatic and I was taken under a court order at 2 a.m. in the morning from this flat in Highbury. My birth mother, no one was in the property. I was there alone, and taken to the Clark family, who were foster carers. They had 2 daughters of their own, Dawn and Amanda, and had been fostering for some time. And they were actually living in Watford in Hertfordshire.
So nowhere close by.
No, just like adjacent, right? Kind of home counties. And the reason for that was because this had kind of, and I don't know, how much understanding you kind of have of social services or children's services and when these things happen. Yeah. But often, if something happens in the middle of the night, it's action stations. Police came along with my social worker. And it's really kind of just trying to join the dots in that moment. Yeah. And they looked at Islington, the kind of list of foster carers for me to go to, and no one was available. Right. And so as I understood it, Rosemary, who's my social worker, kind of then went to the surrounding home counties, Hertfordshire being quite close, Watford being quite close, really. Yeah. It's kind of probably half an hour up the road. And the Clarks happened to be top of the list. And the request was, could you take this little girl just for one night? I just need some more time to find somewhere for her to stay longer term. And so they said yes. And I have heard stories again of it was snowy. It was a really cold winter, apparently. Sounds so kind of cinematic, doesn't it? Yeah. Or it does to me a little bit. And they're kind of scrambling around, calling friends. Have you got some warm clothes for a baby? Because we haven't had a baby for such a long time. And I arrived there and my dad always said and maintained that they kind of took one look at me and said that little girl's not going anywhere. And they kind of could never have known that in that moment, but that's how he felt.
It's a feeling and the straight intuition of that moment. Yeah.
And so they did indeed formally adopt me 3 years later when I was 3. And yeah, that was the start of my life, really. And my memories, that's the only family that I've ever known and remembered.
And when you think about that, so obviously the memories of that moment won't exist in the same way as when you were 10 months and you were taken and you went into the Clark family. But when you think back to that time of a little girl being taken from her birth mum, but actually she was in a flat in Highbury on her own, what's the feeling, the emotion that comes to you?
I think over the years, when I was younger, I was actually quite detached from it. Okay. Like I would tell this story and not necessarily feel that it was really me. Like I'd built up this barrier to almost protect myself. And then I think, or I know, when I became pregnant and then subsequently had my daughter, all of that started to shift. And I hear that a lot for adoptees, that when they become parents, they often become more curious about their birth families, or they want to know more.
Right.
It definitely makes an impact. And for me, and having a girl, right? And everyone, my family, they even say now, my daughter's 5, like it's just like a kind of carbon copy of me. And I think they find that quite emotional, actually, seeing her and almost like doing a double take. It's just like Becca when she was little, and she's very much known as my mini me. And what I had underestimated having Aura is how healing that process has been for me in terms of my adoption and early years and all of the things around that. Small things like I was a really chubby baby, as Rosemary in my notes referred to me as a Bonnie baby, which I think she meant large.
Bonnie, I've never heard that term. But okay.
She wrote something like she's a really Bonnie baby, perhaps a little bit too Bonnie, which, and you see the photos, there's a very chubby baby. And so I had created this narrative when I was younger that was to do with my birth mother maybe not feeding me correctly, or me being malnourished, or all of these stories. You fill in the gaps.
Yeah.
And then I had a very healthy pregnancy and was looking after myself. And I know what happened during my pregnancy.
Yeah.
And I gave birth to this 9'2" very big baby, bless her, 98th percentile. And it was just this moment of like, oh, we're just built that way. We're genetically, we are big babies. And so, yeah, it's kind of witnessing Aura growing up has really helped me fill in some gaps around me, because we're not the same. We're absolutely not the same. And I know that, but we are connected, and she is my daughter. And so there are hints that she brings, that really help me.
And that's
just
beautiful.
Understand that. Yeah,
that's
it really is
beautiful. So take us through the years that you remember most growing up in Watford and Hertfordshire. What was it like growing up as a brown child in a white family?
It's something that was always there. Another early memory when I would have been at infant school was me standing in the playground with my mum and another little girl with her mum standing beside us, and her saying to her mum, like, Mummy, why is that little girl brown and her mummy's white? And I remember saying something to her like, well, because she put me in the oven and forgot to take me out. Like, if I'm very young, it's not that funny, but, I'd often use humor to deflect, like always, and kind of really built that muscle, another kind of defense mechanism, really. So I was always very aware of it. When I was 8, we actually moved out of Watford and moved to Luton, so to a new community, but again, very, very white where we were. And as I just grew older, I just felt really conspicuous. I always felt walking around in the shopping centre or that people were perhaps looking at me or making a judgment about me. I was a curiosity, perhaps.
And was it that they were looking at you and judging you, or was that what you felt? Did you ever get to the bottom of that?
It's hard to say 100%, but I think that they were looking. Like, I'll get another memory that lingers, and I would have been about 11, and I went to the dentist, and my dad took me. And my dad he passed away, unfortunately, in 2019.
Sorry to hear that.
He was a real character, very cheeky, maybe flirtatious. And he had been chatting away to this receptionist at the dentist. It was just the two of us. And then he said, he was going to leave me there to just go and do some shopping and come back afterwards. And after my dad left, this woman turned to me and said, "Is your mum black?" Like, she was so curious about the dynamic between me and my dad. And she was almost shocked that my dad might have a black partner. And it was like, who are you in relation? So there definitely was curiosity around it, and people would ask questions or make comments.
And this was early 90s.
We would have been in the 90s, very early 90s. So I started secondary school in 89. So that would have been around 1990.
And I'm trying to think back into my own history and my own lived experiences of just the curiosity and how people today wouldn't necessarily ask. They might watch, but the ability to find the words would probably not be there as much as they were back then. Whereas I remember walking into places and going, all sorts of weird and wonderful questions, and why aren't you doing this, and why shouldn't you do this? And it was just a bit like, oh, I've just met you for the first time. Whereas I do think that we hold a little bit back nowadays than we did back then.
Well, I think, I mean, this is a whole other conversation. I think people are often suppressing what they might want to really say. There's a politeness that definitely wasn't around back then.
No.
I was constantly being asked, where are you from? No, where are you really from? And, I know from a lot of brown and black friends, people of colour growing up in this country, that's a very normal experience, which I think a lot of white people haven't necessarily appreciated or understood. And sometimes it can be dismissed as, well, people are just interested. And I think one knows the difference between when someone is asking out of genuine curiosity and when they're actually trying to figure out, where do I place you? What box can I put you in?
Yeah, or just being nosy.
They're just being really nosy. I need to understand exactly where you're from, how you're here.
And this is a big part of how you kick off your TED Talk.
Yes. Yeah.
And do you think you've answered that question of where you're from? And not necessarily for the listeners, but just for yourself.
For myself, yeah. So I had the opportunity to do a TED Talk at the beginning of this year, which I was really grateful to be able to do that. And I'm a writer, and I'd written this short piece based on this question, where do you come from? And it kind of went into some of my experiences that I had over the years, and how it's, for anyone who's asked that around race, it can be a charged question, perhaps. But for me, I felt like a double whammy because of my adoption,
right,
and because I couldn't answer the question. So I always felt, when people ask me where you're from, what they're saying to me is, you're brown, so I need to know where that part of your family is from. Because my birth mother, I always knew that she was white, British, pretty straightforward, as it were, right? We're in the UK.
right.
But there was this big question mark because I never had any information growing up around who he was or where he was from. And so I would seriously have people when I was a kid guessing, oh, you don't know, let me guess. And I would,
Wow.
yeah. And also, depending on what my hair's doing, I can kind of look different, or I could be placed in different places, parts of the world, So I've been asked if I've been Greek before, or when I lived in the Middle East, if I'm from that part of the world. All kinds of things. I've even had people say to me, oh, you've got a really good tan. Where have you been? Which I just find utterly bizarre. So, yeah, I found it very challenging. And I also felt, when I was growing up, some weird responsibility to tell the absolute truth. So I'd end up telling people my life story, like to explain why I can't answer the question. And
that's a lot to take on board.
Yeah.
In your early teens, even now, to be fair, to be so open and be so vulnerable.
Well, because I didn't know, it was my nature. I didn't know any different. I didn't know that I could lie if I wanted, or I could just refuse to answer. I didn't know that I had choices, right? Yeah. I just felt I'm being asked something. For whatever reason, I felt like I owed people the story. And because of that, I really felt just a ton of shame. Like I was carrying around, and again, I wouldn't have articulated in that way back then, but I was just carrying around all this shame that I didn't belong, I wasn't good enough, there was something bad about me. And that really, translated as I grew into, kind of low self-esteem and low self-worth, and just, I don't know, just trying to figure out my place in the world, really, and why I was here. And
do you think that shame was yours to carry?
I know now that it was not. I'm very clear on that.
Yeah.
And shame always belongs to someone else, whatever it might be about.
Yeah.
But I did not understand. I only learned that when I was 40. And it was through I had a coach at the time I was working with, and we were doing some deep work around the inner child and shadow work. And he really helped me understand that. And it was a light bulb moment.
Yeah.
Because as soon as he explained that through the work, it made sense. I got it. And that's why I can say that. And I do like to say that to other people, because I feel it's a message that needs to be shared, because so many of us carry around shame that does not belong to us. And I think it can be one of the most powerful and detrimental emotions that one can experience.
Yeah.
So I'm very pleased to have been able to release that. I kind of feel, and it sounds a bit, I don't know, it's not very British, but like healing's a lifelong journey. But I do kind of believe that there's no end. There's no end. So I'm healed now.
Yeah.
For me, it's
miraculously
more,
something happened, and you know, I'm fixed.
Yeah, I'm fixed.
Yeah.
And now I can go on with the rest of my life. Healing for me, how I understand it, is a recognition of how things make us feel, or things that might trigger us.
Yeah.
Like I have, not surprisingly, fears around rejection and abandonment. I can be one of those people that if I message a friend and I don't hear from them for ages, I'll start internalizing, you know, what's going on? Have I done something wrong? And at times my husband has kind of been like, it's absolutely crazy. I said, well, actually, if you think about it, it's kind of not. And so I give myself, in the past, I would have been like, why can't you just get over yourself? Why can't you, you know, just move on from this? Whereas now with those kinds of instances, I'm prepared to give myself more grace, because some stuff happened.
Yeah. And it's deep rooted.
Yeah.
And it takes time.
Yeah.
And as we said, we're on a healing journey. We're not fixed overnight.
No.
Whatever overnight fixing looks like,
yeah,
it doesn't happen.
And it's the ability on the one hand to have been like, what is wrong with you? Why can't you get over yourself? To this recognition of, well, you feel this way sometimes because of abandonment in the past or because of rejection. And so that's okay. We can kind of sit with that, look at it. It doesn't mean that it's true,
no,
that what's happening is true, but that's the why. And I think as human beings, regardless of situations, we're wired to kind of want to understand the whys of things. Why are things happening? Why do I feel this way?
Yeah.
Why is someone behaving in a way? And because I think we're naturally curious. And so
we try to rationalize it.
Yeah,
ultimately.
exactly. We want to make sense of it.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the things that has helped me is having some of those tools to be like, okay, doesn't have to be a bad thing, or it could just be this, or let's just really like sitting with it. And things like developing a meditation practice for me, and breath work, and really utilizing visualization as well. I've really been proactive in finding things to help me, because in the past I did the traditional talking therapy, had some terrible therapists along the way, and things like cognitive behavioral therapy and all of these things, you know, and I didn't necessarily find them particularly helpful. I mean, there's only so many times I want to tell my whole life story.
Yeah.
Whereas what I have found helpful for me is more these tools around grounding myself a bit better, being able to breathe through things, and just creating space. It's like that mantra of, you know, all is well right in here and now. All is well here and now. And sometimes having that opportunity to just focus on this present moment rather than worrying about the past or what's to come. Left to my own defenses, I'll spend a lot of time in my brain in the past or in the future.
Yeah.
And so it's been a real discipline. Having a child helps with this, actually.
Because you have to deal with it.
And they are only present.
Yeah.
They're only present in really focusing on the here and now.
Yeah. You left London, I believe, and went to university in Liverpool.
So, so my family, I was in Watford, and then we moved to Luton when I was 8. And that was in difficult circumstances. My dad had a business which had failed. It was like the mid-80s. It was not a great time.
Right.
And so it was quite a traumatic experience for everyone in the family, my mum in particular. And I look back now, I didn't think it so at the time, but I think probably for my dad too, because it had failed, you know, everything had gone wrong. We had to move away from my mum's beloved house and kind of living in quite a nice neighborhood. I went to a nice school, all of these things, and had to move somewhere else, which wasn't of their choice, you know. And I found it quite difficult. At the school I rocked up at, I was kind of taking the mickey out of because of how I spoke. And I guess I was a bit swattish. I was very bookish.
Yeah. But Watford to Luton isn't very far.
No, but I just spoke differently to my peers. And just stood out. That's kind of his theme.
It was just another reason.
Yeah, it's just another
be
reason. I mean, there were so many reasons, Mira. I mean, one of the things of my childhood, which I haven't touched on, it was a big part, is that my mum in particular is very religious and was part of the Salvation Army. And a lot of people, particularly as an adult, would say, "Oh, isn't that just a charity, or what is that?" But actually, you know, it's a full-on, it's a global church organization. And they wear uniforms, and they have bands, and they have choirs, and if you are a committed salvationist, it can be a really big part of your life. Like, it's a lifestyle, really.
Right.
And so that was another, as a teenager and as a child, I was like, it's just another awkward difference. Like, I'm wearing this uniform every weekend and playing a cornet and all of these things.
And so all the little things on their own, they're not that big, but all of these little things add up to a big mountain, especially when you're in your younger years.
I just wanted to be like my thin blonde friends, and, you know, particularly as a teenager, and boys fancy me, and just all the things, right?
All the things you read in the magazines, all the things that are going on, all the things that you just see. And at least social media wasn't a thing at the time.
Thank God.
But you're still seeing the norm, or what we believe to be the norm.
Well, what we were
TV.
fed. I mean, particularly, there's a lot of talk now. So I grew up with Just 17 magazine and Smash Hits. But Just 17 in particular was the one, I guess. You weren't seeing mixed race models. Not really. I never saw anyone really that looked like me growing up in the media. It's really interesting. There's been a lot on social media more recently about the body shaming of the 90s. You know, Kate Winslet being fat, or even like in Love Actually with Martine McCutcheon being like ridiculous things. But that's what I lived through, and my peers did too. In this whole, just such a toxic time.
Yeah.
So all to say, getting to Liverpool, during my adolescence, I was really badly bullied at school by boys. And I always mention that because I'm a girl's girl, and I had beautiful girlfriends. But at that time, like I said, you just want kind of boys to be maybe a little bit interested, and to be like seemingly abhorrent to these boys, and just like being told I was disgusting and all these other things. I mean, it was so damaging. And so it's just this pile on of like, oh my God, I need to get out of here. I need to get away from this school. I want to be anonymous in terms of being brown, having a white family. I want to get away from the Salvation Army. I just want to get away from absolutely everything.
Run away. Just take me away from this.
Run away.
As quickly as I can.
And, you know, one of the things with my family, they'd always been, from as long as I can remember, telling me I was smart and I was clever and I was definitely going to university, because nobody in my family had been to university. And so there was a lot of investment around me going to university, them because they wanted me to be educated, and they obviously had this strong sense of pride around it, and me, this is my ticket out of here. And so I went and looked at a number of universities, but it was very interesting. My dad would have loved me to go on to Luton University. In fact, we had one of the biggest arguments of our lives together, actually, around the fact that I was not going to Luton University under any circumstances because I need to leave here. But when I kind of did my UCAS form, I remember going to my tutor, who was a woman called Debbie Clark, who I didn't have a particularly close relationship with. But she was the one person who looked at my UCAS form and said, I don't see any red brick universities on here, Rebekah, so I need you to go away and rethink that. I want to see at least 3. And I thought it was really interesting because my family wouldn't have known any different. University's university. But I mentioned that because it was only much later, after the murder of George Floyd and some of the things I experienced in that reckoning, and the reemergence of Black Lives Matters, that I remembered that Debbie Clark was Black, and she was the only person in my world who said to me at that time, I want you to think and dream bigger.
Wow.
And I thought, I was only able to make sense of that over 20 years later.
Yeah.
How important that was.
And what an important statement that was.
Really important. I mean, she changed without me I always remember her making the suggestion, but I didn't know what it meant.
Yeah.
I didn't know then what it meant. And so I went up to Liverpool with my dad and just fell in love with the city and the campus. And it was, the arts faculty and humanities, social sciences is on Abercrombie Square. It's this beautiful kind of Georgian square. Everything, I love a period drama. Yeah, it's just like, this is university.
Right.
I was never going to go to Oxbridge, but this is a university. And my dad was kind of like, this city feels really big. Do you not feel overwhelmed? Like, this is
where I need to be.
This is it. And I did end up there. And I had an amazing time over the 3 years, but I don't think it will surprise you to hear my first year was really tough, because this was going to be my utopia. This was my escape. This was going to be everything that I wanted it to be. And it was my first lesson of wherever you go, there you'll be. Because I basically took all of those insecurities and some of that rubbish that I'd been carrying around all the way up the M6 with me.
Yeah, it didn't disappear as you left Luton.
It didn't disappear, no.
So what did you do?
I think I had time to find really good friends, some of which are still very much in my life. I was with one of them just last night, and found my place within that, people who I loved and who loved me back. And what I also realized at uni is a lot of us have stories by the time we hit 18, 19. Mm-hmm. They're different. But a lot of young people, I think all of us, trauma is quite a loaded word in the English culture, I think. And a lot of us are like to be like, well, nothing that bad happened. It's almost like we want to minimize.
Yeah.
But I personally believe trauma is anything that leaves a lasting mark, that is something that stays with us, that has a negative or challenging impact. And as I looked around at my new friends and peers, stories of childhood bereavement, losing a parent, or divorce, or eating disorders, trauma, or all of this stuff.
Yeah.
And I think, it was that recognition that, I'm not alone in this. Our stories are different, but our kind of experiences, our sense of loss or kind of not understanding ourselves very well, all of that stuff is actually part of growing up.
And also, I think by the time you're 18, you started to go through that you've gone through the puberty journey. You're trying to make sense of it. You haven't necessarily got the right people around you who are giving you the information, or if they have, they're your parents who you don't really listen to or want to listen to.
Yeah.
And so how do you make sense of it? And it's at the point you get to university where you're all in similar situations for the first time that you start making those connections and those conversations. And as you said, although they're different, they do help some of the healing.
Yeah. Because it's the empathy.
It's the relationships that start building.
Exactly. And I think, you're still very young. It's that thing, your brain isn't fully developed until you're around 24, 25.
Yeah.
And I can really see that looking back. I remember so clearly after graduating and being in London, having just a crazy, mad time, that my brain, I couldn't understand at all that one day, I thought 30 was old. You're in your early 20s and 30 is old. It feels really old. And you kind of have, it's this magical thinking almost that that's never going to happen to you.
Yep.
And I remember it.
But in my head, I'm still 21.
Yeah.
I never got to 30 because 30 is really old.
Really old.
Like,
forget about 40.
Wow.
It was only later when I learned about the science, the neurological science, that, that's part of that. It's literally because your brain hasn't yet developed enough for you to fully understand that is going to be your reality one day. And you're not going to escape it.
And past it, unfortunately.
Exactly.
We don't stay in those ages.
No, but I think as well as I become older, and of course I might say this, we need to be doing more as a society and culturally to be telling the good news stories about becoming older.
It's amazing.
Because it really is. And I think there's so much, we've been such a kind of youth-focused culture for so long, and so much emphasis is placed on that. when actually things, as we said at the beginning, they do actually start to get better. And it's things like I would go on girly holidays to Gran Canaria, for example, when I was 18. And I would not really like it. I'd think, what's wrong with me? I'd feel, a bit chubby in my bikini. And I hated the culture of those kind of holidays.
Yeah.
And I remember so clearly kind of being in my 30s and doing nice things with my nice husband. I was like, oh, I just suit being older.
Yeah.
I actually suit being older. And it's like, it's that sense of your soul, isn't it, that stays with you all the way through. It's not necessarily compatible with certain stages of your life. And I think I probably have been an old soul anyway, like when I was saying about kind of being teased or, when I was younger, and I spent a lot of time with older people too. My godmother was in her 60s. So yeah, all of that stuff that made me really odd and awkward as a child are actually the things that I really
make
love
you really
about being
cool as an adult. But isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
You talked earlier about being bullied by boys at school. How did that change over the course of your life in terms of going to university? Did things get better there?
Yeah, I wasn't bullied at all.
Great.
Thank goodness. There was one rugby boy who was a bit of a dick, but that's just part of the course.
Yeah.
But no, in that sense, I was able to show up and have a fresh start and be me and all of the things, again, as I said, that people would think was kind of weird or, not cool when I was younger, would actually kind of endear me to people. So my friend who I was with last night, I met him because I volunteered to be the librarian. This halls of residence had its own library.
Love it.
And me and my friend Jo thought this is a good way to meet boys because they have to walk past the library to get out of the halls. And so it's actually ridiculous, but we were hanging around in the library and like calling these boys in. And two of them went on to be housemates and really good friends now, one who I was with last night. And it's that story, we're kind of like, who's this crazy girl who's getting us to come in the library? Like just silly stuff. Whereas at school, I would have been completely ostracized for that. Or kind of just bullied even more. Whereas at uni, it was different. No one knew about that stuff. It was just me being me, and people seemed to like it for the first time, which was nice.
This episode is brought to you by Play for Change. Play for Change brings together leadership coaching, expert facilitation, and builds communities. They help craft real connections, spark learning, and turn play into powerful experiments to enable better relationships with yourself and others around you. To find out more, go to playforchange.co.uk. Links are in the show notes below. So what happens after university?
Well, what happened after university immediately was another dip because I had built up university, as I said before, to be my escape. These were going to be the best years of my life. It was just going to be amazing. I remember really clearly in that summer holiday after I finished my finals, being back in my bedroom at my parents', just not wanting to get out of bed and saying things like, oh, if those were the best years of my life, what's the point of going on? Because I hadn't made too much of a plan post-university.
Right.
And I knew that I wanted to work perhaps in media or advertising. That had kind of become my love. I did my degree in communication studies. But again, it was kind of funny. After getting out of the bubble and maybe being back home, I'd really lost some confidence about, I remember going to the careers library and looking at all of the graduate recruitment schemes for the likes of M&C Saatchi and Grey London and Abbott Mead Vickers, and just thinking, what's the point of me filling in this form for these ad agencies? For whatever reason, I didn't think that I was good enough and that I wouldn't get through the process. And so I didn't try. And so all of that to say, I kind of, lost my footing a little bit immediately after university, but then gained it quite quickly. I'd moved up to Nottingham temporarily, and then I moved down to London where a lot of my uni friends were. I did start working in advertising, but as a PA, that was kind of my foot in.
Yeah.
And then I actually ended up working in government. I'd been made redundant from the advertising agency, and coming from a working class family, Like I said, and the experience, for example, my dad losing his business and everything else, there's always this kind of sense of financial struggle, lack of security. And so being made redundant so early in my career, I thought I just want to find something that feels secure. And I happened to see this ad in The Guardian for government communication specialists. And I'd never heard of these things, or these people, or these roles. And I applied, and you kind of had to do a set of exams. It was almost like alongside fast track for the Foreign Service. This was for government comms. And I got through, and I just kind of, I loved it. So I was in government as a civil servant about 6.5 years. This was during the Tony Blair premiership. And it was like glory days, particularly working in marketing. So the kinds of things I worked on were TV ads for fire safety. Like I worked on a campaign, it was like push the button, not your luck, to encourage people to test their fire alarms and all kinds of different things. And it was during that period when government was one of the third biggest media spenders in the country, alongside Unilever and Procter & Gamble.
Wow.
Yeah. So
you had
Labour was spending the dosh, because there was a lot of criticism about that in the press. But from my perspective, professionally, there was money for training, that I was working with all of those agencies I just listed who I was too scared to apply to. I was their client, and it was this complete about turn. And I had a particularly amazing boss at one point who really believed in me and gave me opportunities. And it was during that period I really kind of gained my professional confidence.
Yeah.
And I was never going to be a career civil servant. When I did leave my parents, I was absolutely mad. Why would I leave a job for life? But it was one of those, kind of hierarchies where the better you do, you get promoted, the further away from the work. You're just managing people.
Yeah.
And I love the work. I still love anything related to storytelling. I don't like managing people so much. I'm not particularly good at that. So really grateful to have had those years. And then we had the opportunity through John, my husband, to move to the Middle East. And we lived in the UAE for 5 years. And again, that was another kind of, it wasn't immediate, but eventually I was given an amazing opportunity to work with a big media company there. And again, that kind of changed the trajectory of my career. I was still doing stuff that was around people and planet. That's really been the thread through my career. I've been working nearly 25 years now. And have always been really interested in anything that is humanitarian, stuff that matters, or that I think matters. I remember that the boss that I mentioned before, him saying often, well, we're not in the business of selling biscuits, are we, Rebekah? We're doing real work here.
Yeah.
And I always felt really good about that. And some of the things that we were doing, I also really like high profile stuff. I do. I like being able to speak to my friends and saying, did you see that film, or did you see that ad, or whatever, and having a conversation about that, because it engages people. And so, I kind of spent some time traveling, working, doing cool stuff. Or again, going back to my 16-year-old self, flying business and staying in fancy hotels in New York, and never thought those things would happen. But they did.
Dreams started coming to life.
Dreams started coming to life. And, I've mentioned John a couple of times. Again, that girl who's like, no boys fancy me, and they never will.
So tell me about how you met John.
So I spent most of my 20s fairly single, or in inappropriate situations.
Yeah.
And really making bad choices. At the time, I just felt it was more rejection. Like, why don't these guys who I really like me?
Yeah.
But I can definitely say I was also making, I had a role to play in that too, which I wasn't owning at that time. And I'd had a particular heartbreak when I would have been about 28. And I decided that I was actually going to have like a complete ban of anything to do with men for a year, and just kind of get my house in order. Now, I'm into astrology, always have been, but I wasn't aware of the Saturn return then. But it's so clearly it was my Saturn return. I don't know if you know much about this.
I only know enough about astrology because of the people I hang around with in Ibiza. So I don't know enough about it. I don't know how I feel about it, if I believe it, etc. But tell me more about the Saturn return.
Well, the Saturn return happens around 28, 29, and it's this moment. It's obviously individual to everyone, but there's a massive shift in your life. Things change, and are never quite the same afterwards. So Adele, the singer, talks about her Saturn return, and she did like an album about it, basically, and her divorce being part of that.
So it doesn't have to be only at the ages of 28, 29.
No, it is. It is for everyone. Like, it's around that time. You've been on this earth X number. So yeah, it was around the same. It is. It's when it's between 28 and 30.
Okay.
An astrologist will tell you more definitively, but it's around that time. So I can look back and see, it was because it was so, I just made this decision in a way that I never had before. I was kind of ambling along, you know.
So tell us what happened.
So I had my year of no men.
Nice.
And then I went to visit my friend in Dubai. She was living there at the time, having no idea I would be living there the following year. And it was just on the plane. I thought, I'm just starting to feel a bit differently about things. I've had my year. I do feel differently. Maybe I'm ready to kind of open myself up again. And so I'd gone to Dubai and had a nice time with Jules there. And, had just allowed myself to, flirt with some guys. And like I said, open myself up to the possibility. And then shortly after I got back, one of my good friends had a birthday party up in North London. I was living in South London at the time. I got the tube back with this couple. And I remember saying to them, how did you guys meet? And they said, we met on Guardian Soulmates. Now, this is the early days of internet dating when it was still a bit of a taboo, a social taboo. And so I remember the next day, a Sunday, thinking, I'm going to have a look at this Guardian Soulmates. And so I went online and I looked at some guys and I saw John. And, his face was pretty much obscured in his photo with a New York guidebook. And so that was a check because I absolutely love New York. And then all the things he was talking about, I just thought, this guy seems nice. So I wrote his username on a little Post-it note and stuck it on my laptop. Because, of course, now I need to set up a profile of my own and that's going to take some time. And so I did that. And then the algorithm, again, I don't even know what that word was back in 2007. But the algorithm obviously pushed me up because I was a newbie and all these other guys start getting in touch. Like, okay. So I was just messaging. And this was not over a long period by any stretch. But I was messaging these other people. I thought, I must get back to that John guy who I originally thought was interesting. And so we got in touch and we had a few emails and, I kind of liked his banter. And I knew I didn't want a pen pal. Like these guys, they'll be pen pals if you let them. And so I kind of pushed for a date early on because I feel like if you meet someone, you'll just know. And so I remember very clearly meeting John on an Easter Monday after a bit of a boozy Easter Sunday with my friends. At a bar on Bermondsey Street. And when he walked in, I could just sense that he was quite nervous. And, he's not, I'd always gone for the guys with the swagger and the confidence and all of that stuff. And so I thought, I don't know if there's going to be a connection here, basically.
Yeah.
So John sat down and we'd only emailed, so I'd never heard his voice before. And when he started speaking, I said, are you from the Northwest? And he's from Chester. I was like, I could tell because it's very near to Liverpool. And so that was a kind of little
initial
nugget.
connection.
Yeah, yes. And then we just got chatting and John asked me if I had any siblings. And that was another trigger question for me. Where you come from? How many siblings you got? Oh, God, I'm going to talk about my family. And I'd said I've got 2 big sisters who I've already spoken about. I've got 4 sisters in total and I have 2 younger sisters. And my younger sisters, my family started fostering again when I was around 9. They joined my family when I was 12. And although my parents didn't adopt them because they have a relationship with their birth parents, they're my sisters. We grew up together. And people will always be like, 4 sisters, 5 girls, that's so many. And so I very quickly wanted to move away from that and kind of said, I've got 4 sisters. What about you? How many siblings do you have? And he said, well, I've got my big sister, Charlotte. And then when I was growing up, my parents were foster carers. And also I've got 3 adopted siblings. And I tell you, Mira, sitting in that bar, listening to this, I felt this biggest weight just lift from my shoulders that I had no idea was even there.
Yeah.
It was just this moment of, and I remember this thought through my head of, I can tell this guy absolutely anything about my background, my family, and it's not going to be a problem.
But he'll understand because he's seen.
Yeah. And it was just the way as well that he was talking about it. He's like, oh yeah, I loved fostering. It was great having all the kids around. And it's funny because when my parents did start fostering again, I perhaps didn't have the same attitude as John.
Yeah.
But there was just this ease to him and this sense of acceptance, like, whatever. It's not a problem to me. This is all very normal to me. 2 of his siblings are mixed race, It's like, and so, yeah, there was a connection like I'd never had before. And it was
beautiful.
Yeah, it really was. And it's funny because for many years, John in particular wouldn't talk about the fact that that was how we met, because it was. I remember some girl I knew from school saying, "Oh, you still seeing?" As if like emailing, online dating, because a lot of people that I went to school with met their partners at school or down the pub club in Luton or whatever.
Yeah.
Whereas now everyone meets online. It's the only way they meet. So I like to think that we're pioneers.
You were
back
pioneers.
in the day.
What a beautiful story, but also what a way of feeling seen, because I imagine that's what happened in that moment of going, I'm not sure I'm going to like this guy. Oh, I've just felt completely seen.
Well, because it captures a lot of the things I've spoken to you about today.
Yeah.
Of being different, of standing out, of this lived experience of being mixed race in a white family and community. And although John is white himself, he's been part of his siblings' lived experience, right? He's been part of that family dynamic.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it was really, really lovely. But then it was also challenging for me as the relationship progressed, because being seen and being accepted and being ultimately loved by this man was quite difficult for me at times, because, and I suddenly understood that all of those wrong-uns, those men that I so desperately wanted but didn't want me, my part in that was it meant I wasn't being forced to commit to anything myself. I didn't have to be truly vulnerable because I was going for men who were unavailable in whatever way they were. And here was this man who was totally available and totally committed and, wanted us to move in and wanted me to move overseas with him within a year and all of these things. And I'd never experienced that. And it was at times really hard.
Of course it was. Of course it was. What is it that you do today that is a result of who you were as a child?
Like I said before, I've always been really kind of motivated and interested in things that support people, change stories for the better. And I'd built a career out of that. I built my own consultancy, and I was working with really interesting people doing really cool stuff. But when I turned 40, which was another milestone, and I could feel it in the few years approaching, actually, that I was doing these brilliant things, but there was an emptiness around it. And I was starting to kind of get a bit tired of the business class and the hotels. I was physically tired and actually starting to get ill, actually, with the traveling and everything. And John and I, we'd been married probably about 5 years or so at that stage. And we decided that we weren't going to have children. We kind of went back and forth on this. And as 40 was getting nearer, I just felt, it's not another Saturn return, by the way.
Just check it.
That happens later. And it's called something else. But there was definitely this feeling of there are things that aren't quite right. And part of that was my job. I wasn't getting as fulfilled from it. I didn't feel that I had fulfilled my own potential. And part of that, I was starting to really get the niggling feeling that perhaps I did want to try and have a baby after all. And so fortunately, I did get pregnant when I was 40. Finding out I was pregnant was my last birthday present after a week of celebrations, which was really lovely. But something really interesting happened during that year. So I found out I was pregnant in February. I just finished working with one of my major clients at the end of the previous year. And, you know, it's my 40th birthday, as I mentioned. So it's meant to be this new chapter.
Mm-hmm.
And indeed it was. But as I kind of literally was growing in pregnancy, my professional career was just disappearing before my eyes. Like I wasn't being very successful at finding new clients. And it was really a very challenging time. And that continued after I'd had Aura. I sometimes describe it as almost like I felt like I'd made a pact with a Disney villain that, well, yes, my pretty, you can have your child and I will take your career and your financial security, all those kinds of things. But, you know, sometimes you also need to have space, right? I'd said I wanted something different. Be careful what you wish for.
Yeah.
I said I wanted something different. And having this space while I was on maternity leave and just after, and that was the time I was working with Peter, who I mentioned before. And I sought him out because I wanted some guidance around what is this that I'm meant to be doing. And I think it's a thing. Purpose is another charged word, I think, and it's kind of bandied around so much now. We should all be looking for our purpose or living our purpose. And I definitely at that stage bought into the narrative or the idea that purpose was some external thing that I needed to seek out.
Right.
And I now believe and understand that purpose is already within us, you know. It's the stuff that lights us up without us needing to think about it too much, or is part of your journey or your story that is to be kind of realized in a different way or is pointing you in a certain direction. And that's what I found through this work with Peter. Like I was thinking, like I said, it was this crossroads of turning 40 and this kind of realization that, gosh, I've spent the last 20 years really coming to terms with and working through and healing things that happened in the first 20 years of my life. And I look around and I feel like I'm not alone in that. What is it that's going on culturally that we'll even joke about your parents will mess you up or tell me about your difficult childhood? And it's almost like this acceptance that stuff happens in childhood, and it does. Maybe you'll figure it out. Maybe you won't. You know, maybe you'll have the resources to get support. Maybe you won't even have the self-awareness, right, to make those connections. And I got really curious about that. And that coupled with having my own baby, and I started to look into, I was hearing murmurings around like kind of children's mental health crisis. This is pre-pandemic. So I started doing my research into that and seeing shocking figures. Like at that point, it was 1 in 7 children had a diagnosed mental health issue. 88% of kids reported to Action Children that they have worries and anxieties on a daily basis. So something was going on.
Right.
And I thought that that was really interesting. And then the pandemic happened and just exacerbated all of this. So now we're looking at 1 in 4 kids having a diagnosed mental health.
So we go from 1 in 7 to 1 in 4.
Yeah, since 2017.
Right.
Yeah, those are the most, 1 in 4 is the most up-to-date figure. And so when I was thinking about that, okay, whatever's happening, and there are different reasons for that, which we could go into. Some of it's social media, some of it's socioeconomic, some of it's the education system, which again is a big bugbear of mine. But the fact is, there are no clear solutions in place. In fact, the NHS has publicly come out and said they'll only be able to support 1/3 of children that are referred to them. And then we're kind of looking at the increase in neurodiversity as well, where parents aren't necessarily getting the support, or the children getting the support that they need around that, whether it's assessment and diagnosis or whatever that might be. And so when I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about, well, what are some of the things that have really helped me actually? And what are some of the things I now know that I would have loved being aware of when I was a child or when I was a teenager? And as I mentioned, I'd kind of experienced all these different things, from traditional talking therapy to hypnotherapy to whatever. And it was in the more recent years, than that kind of 10 years previously, where I'd found out about breath work and sound healing, and the one I love most of all, which is emotional freedom technique, which is also known as tapping.
Yeah.
And I just started looking at the likes of Headspace and Calm and thinking, these guys have done a brilliant job, phenomenal job of mainstreaming mindfulness. But I kind of looked at their offer, and although they do stuff for kids, it's quite passive. Kind of press play and listen, which as adults we can choose to do. But I was doing lots of research, talking to kids, filming them. And a lot of them saying that actually can make me feel more anxious, like sitting still. I want to move my body, I want to do stuff. And so I basically happened upon this idea that I want to bring these 3 modalities to children and to young children specifically.
Meditation.
It's breath work, sound healing, and tapping. And let's focus on 3 to 12-year-olds because I really felt there's an opportunity for some preventative work here. But also, I had a teacher friend who had taken on a job of supporting kids who've been signed off school. And she's working with kids as young as 4 and 5. And so it's clear there are very young children in crisis. And when I kind of thought about the big idea of this or the vision, I just kind of got really excited about what if we had a generation of kids growing up with when stuff happens, I'm going to do a bit of tapping, or I'm going to go to my breath work, I'm going to use these tools. And we could maybe kind of really disrupt some of those neural pathways. And some of the things that really took root for me wouldn't necessarily be able to take root in the same way for some of these kids. So I was thinking, what kind of adults might they become? Like, could they actually potentially enter young adulthood with less baggage? Stuff's going to happen.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But they have techniques in which to help and support them.
And I thought that could be really interesting and incredible. And then if we took that step further, if some of those adults chose to become parents, how might they utilize these tools in their parenting with their kids? And could we actually start breaking these cycles of generational trauma?
Yeah.
And so that is the work I'm focusing on now, and just doing some really exciting things around bringing that to life.
And how long have you been doing that now?
Well, like I said, the original idea came to me about 2019. So it's been a side project for a few years. A lot of people don't know about these modalities. So there's been an education piece. And like all good startups, lots of experimentation. It's like, well, if this is the problem and the solution's in these modalities, what is the product, if you like? Or what is
how do you
do that?
Yep.
And so I was lucky. Well, actually, I'm not going to say I was lucky. I worked really hard.
Well done.
And won an Innovate UK grant earlier this year. And that money is funding a very exciting project that's really rooted in story for 4 to 6-year-olds and using our characters, because we have Happy Marlowe is the name of the company, and Marlowe is named after my Whippet dog. And so we have a gang of characters that are really going to bring these modalities to life in a way that feels age appropriate and fun and effortless. Like, I don't want to be in the business of instructional kids. This is how we tap, or this is how we breathe. I'm really excited about this idea of hiding the spinach, that phrase of, kind of embedding
it within.
Yeah, just beautiful, engaging stories. And they pick it up that way.
Amazing. How incredible.
Thank you.
If there was any advice to the listeners out there who are adoptees or even adopting, or even parents who are looking at adoption, what's some of the advice you would give them?
I mean, I was asked this recently about a woman was going through the final process of adopting a child, and she'd said, what advice would any adoptees give? And one of the things I would say in that scenario is, please be ready, willing, and able to hold the hand of your child as and when they want to find out more about where they come from, or if they want to connect with their birth family. Because I know in a lot of cases, adoptive parents can find that very hard, or take it personally, or feel, just fearful and triggered. But I believe it's the natural and normal. Not everyone's going to feel that way, but a lot of people will, you know, when you
There's a curiosity
There's a curiosity about where you come from, who your parents might be. What are these traits that I have?
Who do I look like?
Who do I look like?
Basic things that I take for granted.
Yeah, that I think anyone who kind of knows their birth family will take for granted. And so I know that a lot of adoptive parents don't find the thought of that easy, but it's really, really important.
Yeah.
I know my own parents, because they were scared. I understand why, but they couldn't support me in that way. It was too difficult. And I do think that it's part of that parenting role.
Yeah.
And then the other piece, I'd just say, you did ask about what would other adoptees say. I mean, it really depends, but I do want to share a story. Another adoptee woman got in touch with me because she was making a documentary about transracial adoptees. So people like me who are from a person of color who's been adopted by a white family. And she had said to me just in passing, she's like, I'm never going to have children. I definitely don't want to have children. And I said, oh, why? And she said, I just feel that it will be traumatic for me and will be triggering around my own birth. And I just don't want to go through that. And she said this to me shortly after I'd had my daughter. So I'm very aware this is my experience. And so I gently said to her, I just invite you to consider the opposite to be a possibility. Because rather than it being painful, it could also be joyful
and
healing.
Yeah.
And she was really, lovely and said, I really appreciate you saying that because I've never even allowed myself to think of that as a possibility.
Yeah.
And so I think it's about being open for whatever it might be, whether it's children or understanding yourself better. Or I think when you're adopted, not always, but often other people can almost put you in a box, and that can happen quite early for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And I think part of becoming truly your own person is kind of wriggling, fighting, however you want to get out of that box and create your own reality, which is something that I've definitely done.
And talking about creating your own reality, yes, you have had some differences. As we said, everyone who grows up has their own journey and their own experiences to take forward. But what you've just said about being your own person, how do I do that more?
Well, I think first of all, you need to know who that person is. I think it's Dolly Parton. I try and remember this. She says, find out who you are and do that on purpose. Be more you type of thing. And I think for me, I don't know, everyone is different, but it's just a confidence that's come with age, and starting to really like yourself, actually. I remember John saying early on, we were in dating, he's like, I just don't, he's like, I love you, but I don't think you like yourself very much, which was a really hard thing to hear. But with time, shedding that shame that doesn't belong to us, and kind of understanding, I understand more now about some of the circumstances of my conception and my birth and what my birth mother was going through. And I've never ever felt any feelings of hatred towards her, or never felt, oh, I wish I'd stayed with her. I know that wasn't meant to be. But I'm now in a place where I can sit here and happily talk to you about all of this stuff, and I'm not going to cry, because I feel at peace with it.
Yeah.
But I do think for me, at least, that's something that's just taken time. And so I guess to answer your question, it's having the time alone with yourself to figure out, who are you? What do you want? It's like my year of no men.
Yeah.
That was a good opportunity to
Who do I
find
want to
out.
be?
Yeah, who do I want to be? Because once I got rid of that distraction, because I was almost consumed with, I need to have a boyfriend, never had a boyfriend. Other things happened, like I started saving money for the first time. I decided, the irony, I decided I was actually going to go traveling. I was going to leave London, go traveling. And then I met John.
Of course.
Yeah, of course.
Perfect timing.
So it's those things. And like I said, I guess I'm coming to this answer as I talk to you. It was during my maternity leave, or that quiet time of business being really slow, where the idea for Happy Marlowe started to germinate. So there's something around space
and silence.
Quiet, yeah, space and quiet.
Yeah.
It's in those moments, and sometimes they need to be a little bit extended, that we can really find out who we are.
We started this conversation very nicely with who is Rebekah. taking us full circle back, is there anything that you would change based on reflecting on what we've just talked about?
I mean, there's tons I would change. Again, there's this another saying around healing is really bittersweet, because the sweet part is that you've healed in some way and you hopefully feel better as a result of that. But it's really bitter because you can see the past. I can see the past through a completely different lens now. And like I said before, I was making some really bad choices. I wasn't loving myself enough. I wasn't giving myself enough credit. And I think a lot of people say, oh, I'd love to be in my 20s again, but knowing what I know now.
Yep.
And I think that's quite a common theme. So I can be quite nostalgic. And so would I change anything? Kind of no, because then I wouldn't be here now. But then there are some different choices that if I did have to do it all over again, that I might make differently. It's hard to separate the two, though.
Yeah.
If I hadn't had all of those horrible men in my 20s, then that wouldn't have been a foil to my lovely husband and me recognizing the worth in who he is, because he didn't show up with the swagger and all of that stuff that I thought was so important.
Yeah. And it makes you think about the differences in who you think you need in your life versus what you actually need and who you need. And as another guest says, the perfect people arrive at the perfect time. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thanks for having me.
It's been wonderful.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed that conversation, please share A Class of Their Own podcast with your friends and family. Subscribe, follow and like. It really helps us continue to grow. Keep being you through connection, learning and play. You are a class of your own.